Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our tutorial, as the weather has turned, it's September now, I thought we'd make a super simple little bat. Now you can wear these as earrings, you can have them as charms, use them as wall decor at any time of the year if you're into bats. But you know, Halloween's coming, so let's celebrate that with something a little bit quirky. Let's head down to the board, we'll take a closer look, and then we'll work together on this super achievable project. Here's our unbelievably easy hint of a bat design. So you can hang them either from the central section or from one of those wings. You can embellish by adding beads inside the frame or outside if you prefer. Really more like a hint of a bat. That's what we're going to work towards together today. I'm going to be working with 1mm gauge wire, and I have a 12-inch length ready to go. Now I'm going to begin around about in the middle, so I'll warm the central third of wire. And then the first thing I'm going to do is grab in my bent chain nose pliers to create a really strong angle down at the bottom. Now we don't actually want it to be a point, we want there to be like a little bit of a miniature U shape just down here. But we do want that to have a little bit of focus, so it's obvious a shape, and I'm going to strengthen that by just opening and closing my pliers over the top. Now you can work with a pencil to create the next part of the shape, but I'm going to be grabbing in either a wooden mandrel, and this is a 9.5mm, or I shall probably use my multi-step bail making pliers. So you have options. You could equally use a straw, a steel drinking straw is ideal, or you can use a pencil, something like that. So I'm just going to warm through either side of that central little U shape, and we don't want to close it up. We want there to be a couple of millimeters between that little gap down at the bottom there. So why don't we use step number 5 and see how that looks. So I'm going to pop those pliers in and just start creating a little bit of a shape so that it comes away down at the bottom. Now it's probably going to be easier on camera if I use those wooden mandrels instead of the pliers today. So that's what we're going to go for. So I'm just going to turn that away until I get like a cartoon M. You know, when you were a child and you used to draw birds in the distance? Something like that. So we're going to go for the other side as well until we get a fairly similar shape, something along these lines. So again, you can use any round form that you desire. What we do need to do, however, is to make sure that this stays completely flat. So obviously with the camera being a couple of inches above the project, it's slightly more tricky for me to show you that in the proper orientation. So it's just a case of making sure that that sits flat down on the board as if you're designing between two panes of glass. So once you've got a shape that you're happy with, I'm just going to assess that they are pretty much similar. So I'll just pop that form back in. That looks reasonable to me. And what we're going to do is create another one of these little bends in the wire. But every time we create one of these bends, it needs to be further up. If you imagine a line across the base where that U shape is, the next time we create a bend, it needs to be about halfway between this little base of the project and the hump up at the top of that form. So with that in mind, I'm going to grip across that section with my pliers, push the wire up and away, and you'll see that we're around about halfway up. So if I flip the design over, I need to repeat that. And this is classically where it all goes a bit wrong for me, because I don't measure really. So let's just push that wire away gently to begin with. And if it looks markedly different, then take a second to just try and get that to be a little bit more similar. So let's just push that down a bit and then back up again. Once you've decided that that does indeed look how you want it to, you can refine that shape to make it just a little bit tighter. Once you've decided that they are close enough to the same. So I'm going to bring both of those wires into a kind of upright position. So let's give that a bit of a squish. So they're now both heading northwards on your design. The bead that I've got here in hand is between 16 and 18mm, and it's a non-faceted, smooth, fairly chubby coin bead. I have something similar over here in agate, and then I have this one in howlite. So we'll make one of each, I think, today. What we're going to do now is basically repeat our first manoeuvre. So if I pop that round form back in, bring that wire all the way around, Allow that to come down further than you need if you want to, and you can just check that those are the same size. Give your wire a warm every now and again, and then just pop that back down on the board to see if you're getting symmetry. So it's a little bit higher up on this side than it is on this. So all you would need to do is just put that round form back in and rotate that around slightly. So we're going to follow the same logic. If you imagine we have a line left to right at the base, a line left to right at that low point, then we're going to create a bend in the wire just here, which is approximately halfway between the top of that hump and the lowest point just here. So we'll do one of those now. Pop that plier in and push the wire up and away again. So you can, as I said before, just pop your round form in to make sure that you're keeping those as similar as possible. And then just strengthen that shape when you're happy with it. So what you do on one side, you must do on the other. So you can, if you need to, just have a little ruler. Let me just grab a rule. And make sure that you're kind of hitting those same sort of levels. You can work with graph paper if that helps you out at all. Whatever makes your life easier. So I think we're slightly higher on this side. So I'm just going to draw that down ever so slightly. Pop my pliers in across and then push the wire up and away. And we're looking for this again to go upwards, like so. So we have now a couple of little kind of divots going upwards, or finger shapes, and I think we'll just do one more and then we'll bring the wires back towards the centre. So again, I'm going to pop my round form in and just draw that wire around. This time I'm not going to bring it quite so far down. If I flip the design over, what you do on one side you should immediately do on the other. That looks pretty reasonable. Now, when you've got as many little shapes as you want to, it looks a bit like somebody's been making pastry. What we're going to do is draw the last one out to the side. So what I'm doing is I'm pressing quite firmly to retain that lovely arcing shape, and again here, but I'm going to bring both of those wires out side to side. So the next thing that we're going to do is to grip across that wire and push both of them strongly back over towards the middle. So I'm just going to use my thumb to create a nice arc shape, which I'm going to draw down over the centre just for now. Let's do the same on the other side. So you can obviously create half of this, create that as a sketch on your worksheet or on some paper, and then you can copy exactly the same way. I'm kind of eyeballing it today, which is fine because my bats are quirky. And again, I'm going to grip hold of that wire, use my thumb to create a nice rounded form and just bring that down. Now at this stage you can take a few minutes just to make sure that you're happy with how that's all looking, and I'll meet you back in a second. So do just take your time at this stage, see if you can get them to be as symmetrical as possible. If you're making them as earrings or as repeatable charms, then again, take your time. You have the option of creating an outline or even photocopying that so that you can recreate an exact image of that piece. We're going to head back down to the board now and I'll show you how you can strengthen that up slightly, and then we will set that lovely coin bead. Now, before we move on to setting the bead, I just want to make sure that these are going to stand up to everyday wear and tear. So you can see that my bats are not exactly the same. I'm going to make these as just individual pieces, but you can obviously take your time and get those to be identical if you need them to be. So before you commit that shape, I'm just going to edit that ever so slightly, make sure that I'm happy, and overall right now I am. So you can use nylon jaw pliers if you prefer to ensure that you don't mark that wire, and just open and close those pliers over the sections of wire to make sure that they're nice and strong. Another way that you can add some strength to this design is to apply a little bit of hammering. What we don't want to do is hammer too far along this central V section just up at the top, because we will require that to move around in just a moment. What we're going to do is hammer from just beyond the tip of the wings all the way along the base and up the other side. We're going to ignore this section in the middle because we need that to flex. So I'm going to quite lightly hammer these today, and when I get down to that central section, I'm just going to prise the design apart like so, and make sure that when I hammer that base section, I can just tuck a piece away, pull the one wing out of the way, and then I can hammer all the way down without causing any disruption to the general shape of the piece. So again, just take your time and you will be able to get that into a nice strong form without too much issue. Your alternative, as I mentioned before, is to squish across that wire with any flat facing pliers to add a little bit of work hardening. So the tendency of any wire form when it's being hammered flatter or stronger is to spread slightly. So do take a little moment or two just to make sure that everything is where you want it to be, and you do still have the capacity to flex that up a little should you need to. So what we're going to do is to make one of these wires into the bead carrying wire, and the other one will become a little bit where the whole thing connects together. And again, this is an absolute beginner's project. It's just a really cute little bat decal. So if you have one that's slightly longer, use the slightly shorter one for the bead and reserve the slightly longer one. But either way, you don't really need a huge amount of wire to make this work. So we're just going to put a little bit of warmth through whichever wire you've chosen to carry the bead to make sure that we can get that to sit where we want it to. And what I'm looking to happen is for the wire that's going to carry the bead to come all the way over to the central section, and then kind of bend down towards where we started, that little point down at the base. So bearing in mind the size of your bead, now I've gone for coin beads because they sit really, really flat. So this will sit against a wall without any problems. You can hang it from either one of the wingtips or from that central spiral as you prefer. But what we need to have happening is for the wire to travel over to the centre. If you imagine a straight line running up the middle here, and then we're going to draw the tail of wire down the middle, and I'm using my fingers to put a bend in here because I don't want to pressure that wire just yet. I want to make sure that when I pop the bead in, it sits centrally over that middle little cartoon seagull shape. So that's sitting exactly where I want it to sit. If you find that you need to just sort of push the wing up a bit and move that bend along because you warmed the wire first, you absolutely can. So I've just moved that along slightly, and I'm going to add a little bit more of a curve to this right hand wing, so that that sits in a position that I like the look of. Once you've decided that that wing is exactly where you want it to be, we're just going to support that bead into position, making sure that you've got space for the bead to sit above those two lowest M-shaped sections. I'm going to pinch that into position and just push the wire back around that U-shaped point where we first began. So once you've got that little U shape in, what we're going to do is to trim the wire. I've abandoned my cutters somewhere. Let's just grab those. And what we're going to do is to cut that wire to around about 10 millimeters to begin with. You can always trim a little bit more off. It's much harder to put a bit more wire back on again. So we're going to sit that bat body or bead into position, and what we're looking to have happen is for that tail of wire just to move up the back and to sit immediately underneath that bead. And I'm just going to push that into position by hand. So you can see that we've got this little U shape going on around the other U shape. I'm going to make sure it's centralised, and I'm going to push that in by hand. Now you may need to shave just the tiniest amount of wire off the end if that doesn't fit, but if you take a look at the front, you'll soon see whether that makes you happy or not. I think I'm going to actually move that bend down a little bit. So I'm going to draw back the shape I just made, pull that outwards just a little bit, and I'm going to move that slightly closer to the bead, and I'm going to trim a couple of millimeters of that tail of wire away, being careful not to trim any of the wrong parts. Again, it's easier to cut a little bit more off than it is to put a little bit on. So once I'm happy that that now sits exactly where I want it to, I'm going to push that back down. Now this is the second time I'm moving it into position, so it might be a little bit more tense this time. If that's the case, you can kind of put it into position. We're looking at the back of the design, and give that a very gentle little squish What we want to have happen is the cut end of wire to sit behind that bar beneath the bead, so you can't see it from the front. So don't squish it too hard or it might move over to the side. When you bring that back round the front, you'll soon work out if it's worked. If it hasn't, just open that out and give it a straighten, and you will soon get that sorted. Now the remaining wire up at the top, you'll want to make sure that your wings are the same. So just give that a bit of a shape if you need to. And then when you're happy, that looks about right to me. They look about approximately symmetrical. I'm just going to grip where that wire passes behind the wire that goes in the top of the bead, and I'm going to create a bend just there. So I don't need a huge amount of wire, but I don't want to cut off too much because I want to have a little spiral. So I've trimmed that to about 1.25 inches, and I'm just going to push that into position so that that bend occurs just above the top of that bead. And when it's in position, and I'm happy that the wings are both the same size, I'm going to draw that wire back in the direction that it came from. So you may find that you need to take a few minutes just to get everything to sit where it's supposed to sit. And then when you're happy with it, give it another little squish, and you will be able to get that to sit down. What we're going to do now is to turn this little inch and a smidge of wire up at the top into a spiral, into which we can attach a piece of string or an earring finding if you prefer. So let's turn that all the way around. I'm making a really big open spiral and then closing it up so that it gets a nice round centre to that spiral form. Give that a squish and then gently turn this into the top section, middle, above that bead. So you can just take your time, make sure it's nice and neat and tidy, and bring that down into position. Now I will take a few minutes just to make sure that that little tail bit on the back is behaving, so you can just tease that over until it sits where it's supposed to. If it really has gone awry, you can simply trim that little end bit away and crimp it slightly further down. So this is a very delicate moment. Don't cut the wrong bit of wire. I've just taken that last tiny little bit of tail off that was getting on my nerves, and there's still enough wire now. Let's straighten this up to just crimp around that bottom U shape where we began the design. So if I just hold that sideways, you can see it's a very tiny little loop now, and I'm just going to push very softly until that cut end sits against the front pass of wire, and in that way it's just a little bit neater, and you can use the bead to sit that down into position. You will want to take a few more minutes as well just to tighten up that little spiral so it sits dead centre at the top. And then you've got the option of whether or not you want to bead into those wings or do something else really. So there's your easiest ever bat charms earrings decorations. Really simple little bat design for you there. Very fast to make up. Quirky little earrings. Very simplistic design. However, if you wanted to add some beads, I'm just going to add a little bit more as an optional addition. I've got a packet of very sparkly little blue glass beads, which I'm going to line on the inside. And I'll show you how to start that off just now. So I have a 24-inch length of that 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, and I'm going to lay around about 1 inch over the top, just near that spiral at the top centre. So what I want to do is to get a really good strong connection point to my bat frame. So I'm going to wind that round about 7 times. It doesn't need to be that many, but because I want to have a little bit of space between where my wire wraps on and where my first bead sits, I'm going to allow a couple of extra turns. If you are working with a 0.4mm or 26 gauge, normally 3 turns of wire for little tiny beads is plenty, but I'm just going to make sure that that spiral of wire is nice and tight, and then I'm going to scooch that down to underneath where that little spiral is. So what we're going to do now is to grab in one of those little sparkly faceted beads. Now these are 2 by 3mm faceted rondelles in half coated, and it's kind of a blue and grey colour. If you've got a kink on the other end of your wire, it's not worth the time faffing around, unless of course you're working with a precious metal, and then it probably is. So I'm going to add one of these little beauties on. These really do sparkle and catch the light, and bring that all the way down. Now the wire I'm working with is just a teeny bit springy, so it's going to mess around. What I think I'm going to do today is to have a line of beads on the inside of the frame. So the finer gauge wire is coming off the top of my bat wing. So I'm just going to sit the bead against the inside of that frame, push the leading edge through down inside that wing, and draw the tail through. As I mentioned, it's quite a springy wire. I'm going to push the bead against the inside of that frame, hold that still, and sharply draw the wire underneath the frame back to the outside of that bat wing frame. And all I'm going to do now is to wrap 3 times around that frame wire. So that's 1, that's 2, sorry about the noise, and then there is a 3rd wrap. So all we'll do now is add in a 2nd bead. If I can find A at the end of the wire and B the hole in the bead, and then zip line that down into position as well. I'm just going to repeat that all the way around until I've filled the inside of the first wing. If I've got plenty of wire left, I will simply draw that wire once around that central core wire that comes through the main bead and continue on the other side. So I may just do a few plain wraps with no beads around this area, and then continue beading under here. However, if you're getting short of wire, and we started with 24 inches, you can simply finish with several wraps around just the frame and start afresh. You could even start afresh on the top side and work in the opposite direction, whatever makes you happy. Once I finish this, I'll pop a photo on the outro screen for you. So that's what it looks like when it's been beaded with sparkly little crystals. Or there's one which is just the plain black agate bead. I'll photograph those for you now. Thanks ever so much for watching today. Do please consider liking the video, leaving a comment. Offering a subscription costs you nothing, and nor does hyping the video, and it helps me to be seen by the wider community. Thanks so much for hanging out today, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.